Welcome to the course Qualitative Methods for Business and Management. This video lecture is about the history and philosophy of qualitative research methods. Overall, this lecture is structured into 4 parts, which are listed here. And in this particular video, we will cover the first part of this video lecture, namely a brief introduction to the philosophy of science. Well, when I talk about the philosophy of science, I just want to give you a very brief rundown of a huge field, an entire branch of philosophy. And you can see that I've listed a couple of books that I like about the philosophy of science. And these are by no means exhaustive. They're just very nice and illustrative about certain aspects of movement in this entire branch. And they're by no means exhaustive or complete. So what is this? Philosophy of science is the branch of philosophies that tries to answer the questions, how do we do science? And how do we know what we know? What is knowledge and how do we know that we've created it, right? So it tries to figure out, how should we do science such that we actually create knowledge that kind of betters the human condition, it's kind of useful or effective, so to speak. And the philosophers, the people that try to work on these topics, they're called philosophers of science. And you can see on the right-hand side, there are some very famous ones, like Karl Popper is very well known, Paul Feyerabend, he's an Austrian philosopher, Alan Chalmers, the top book, that's an Australian philosophers, and all these people are concerned with the questions like, what is the right way of doing science so that we create knowledge that's kind of useful and good in a way? Yeah. So if you will, philosophers of science are research in a way that come up with theories about what science is and how it should be done. And I'm calling them theories because this is by no means a one size fits all or a consensus in any way, right? So you can see here that I mentioned a book that's called Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. I'm not going to cover this book in detail, but the interesting thing about this book is basically that it offers a contrarian philosophy of science to what is generally or more widely accepted to be an approach of doing science that goes back to Popper and this logic of scientific discovery, right? So how do we do good science? And Paul Feyerabend is interesting because he basically came up with a counter proposal and said all this method, all this logic, this process of discovery is rubbish. We should we should not have any method. We should not have a scientific method, right? His book is called Against Method, right? So I'm not covering these philosophical debates in detail. It just goes to show that these are all just theories in a way. Like these are all beliefs about, this is how we should be doing things in science. This is how we should do it differently or better or so forth. And there are theories, and some people chose to believe one theory. And as you can see with the example of Feyerabend, there are people that offer alternative theories or debate that. So why is this important? Well, this is a little bit of a history lessons, right? So I usually go back and tell people in the class and say, like, look, what we know is a very fluid, ephemeral, temporary thing. 1,000 years ago, we knew the earth was flat, and God created it. And, and if we sailed to the horizon, we would drop off and fall into eternal death. We knew that, right? Everyone knew that. No one would know anything differently, right? So now we look at this and say, like, oh, that's ridiculous. Yeah. But back then, we knew this for certainty. And when I was a kid, we knew we had 9 planets in our solar system. And now we know we have 8, and Pluto isn't really a planet, and so forth. So that goes to think like we always know things, so to speak, but this knowledge gets updated from time to time. And the interesting thing from a science or from a research perspective is that research as a way of creating knowledge is in a way a pretty modern, a pretty recent thing. It's only a couple of 100 years old, right? So you may have seen this. This is a classical geocentric model of the Earth. The Earth is a flat disk, really, and above it are the heavens, and above that is God, right? So the Earth is the center of the universe, and the sun moves around it. And we have this horizon where, the disk drops off. Now, if you think about it, we may think this is ludicrous now, although there are some so-called flat Earth believers that still believe this. But, for all we knew, this was how the universe was constructed. How do we know this? Well, first of all, our own observation confirmed this, right? So we see the sun rise up in the east. We see that it, goes over the south during the midday, and then it drops into the ocean or drops in the horizon in the west. So it goes up on the left, and takes a turn across the earth, and drops down. So that's exactly what it looks like. It looks like this every day. So that's our own observations. We saw an horizon. If you go to the ocean, you do see a horizon. It looks like a line where, like the ocean stops and heavens begins. And we see the sun rise and fall, and we see the moon come up, and the stars at night, and so forth. So it looks like we are in the middle, and everything's moving around us. So number one. Number two, all the people that had knowledge, all the influential knowledge brokers of the time, um, told us that this is exactly how what the universe looks like. Now, again, what did this look like? What were these knowledge people back then? They were not scientists in the way that we think of scientists today, but these were people that had high esteem. Bishops, priests, teachers, which typically came from a religious background, right? So it was written in a book like the Bible, which was a very important book at the time. So for the knowledge that we had at the time in writing, in the books, from the people that knew more than the common people on the street, and our own observation, everyone confirmed to us, like, well, that's exactly what the universe looks like. Of course, we then know that this is sort of changed. This is the same model, right? Um, the Earth is then it moved. Sorry, then we moved Copernicus. We moved to this so-called heliocentric model, where the sun is in the middle and the Earth moves around the sun. Right? That was crazy. Again, put yourself in the shoes of a 15th century person, where someone says, "I'm like, well, no, 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 you guys, you got it wrong." Right? So the sun isn't moving around the Earth, and the planets aren't moving around the Earth. The Earth is one of the planets, one of several, and we all move around the sun. Well, that was contradicting everything we saw, everything we knew, and everything that we could read or, what people told us at that time. How did Copernicus come up with that? Well, what he did is he basically used what we would now call a telescope. He used a little device, a magnifying glass, that allowed him to look up in the sky and notice a slight difference, some nuance in the observation that we see and see. For example, he noticed that actually, the different other planets that we could see, right? So, for example, you can see Venus here with your bare eye, and depending on the season and the conditions, you sometimes can even see, Uranus from Earth, right? So sometimes you can see these planets, but if you look very closely, they're not actually in the right position. They're not actually in the position that would fit with the theory that they move around the Earth in concentric circles, right? So he noticed that a much better explanation is that it's not the sun and the other planets moving around the Earth, but rather the Earth is moving around the sun. So the heliocentric model was born. That was a huge shift, right? And he came up with this by using an instrument, a telescope, a better way of measuring things such as distance from planets to one another, distance from the Earth to the sun, or other sort of heavenly objects. And that also allowed him to calculate much more precisely the curvature. And he noticed that it's, eventually we notice it's not even a circle, it's an ellipse, right? It kind of is round, but it's not quite the same thing. So all of this is part of what we now call the scientific revolution, which happened around that age of Copernicus and Galileo and some other people who questioned what we knew and decided to sort of, do research, or what we could now call research, and come up with other knowledge that, eventually came out to say, like, well, that's better knowledge. It's actually more true, more effective, more useful, right? So this is what we now call the scientific revolution, the emergence of a new approach to knowledge gathering, one that's called the scientific method, which uses technologies and instruments like telescopes. It more carefully observes, measures, and tests things better than we've done in the past. Now, but at the time, this was a big revolution because not only did it go against all received wisdom at the time, it also took a long time for some of these instruments to be accepted by people, right? So, it's simple to say, like, yeah, sure, you use a telescope, you can look better into the sky with that thing. In the Middle Ages, this was conceived witchcraft. You saw something that you couldn't see with your naked eye. But of course, I can trust my naked eye because it's mine, right? So I can trust my own observations. Now, here come a couple of people and they have these instruments, these magical witch boxes through which I can see different things. I can see things differently. Yeah, for example, with a telescope, you can look into the sky and you can see planets that you would not be able to see with your bare eye. You can see, craters on the moon and, all sorts of other things that you cannot see with your naked eye. So this is a huge shift because if I can't trust my senses as a source of knowledge, what else might it be? And, again, this is Middle Ages, and it goes against everything that religious leaders and political leaders and everybody else at the time tells us it must be witchcraft, right? So this was a very difficult time for people to get these instruments and measurements and technologies accepted without being burned alive, literally, right? So you see on the right-hand side a guy that's called Sir Francis Bacon, and he's known as the sort of the godfather of what we call the scientific method because he was basically the first. He's an English statesman and philosopher. And he said, look, what we need to do is we need to use theoretical knowledge like mathematics, which we already had at the time. And we need to do something that he called experimentation with instruments, right? So a careful, systematic way of gathering, observing, measuring, and testing data. We want to, share these results so other people can look at the results. So they're not hidden, they're not ours, they're not, in the Vatican in a book that no one else can see. They're openly, and we need to, have some sort of quality assurance. We want other people to confirm or disconfirm what I say. This is what is now called a peer review, right? So whatever I'm finding, whatever my results are first checked by other people, and only if they think this is well done, then it's accepted knowledge. Yeah. And again, this is a revolution because it went against everything that was in vogue and that was established at the time. Again, religion was huge in the Middle Ages in Europe, where all these revolution took place mostly. Religious leaders had to say of how the world was created, how we structured the week. They were the political leaders at the time, right? The Pope and the Emperor and the kings, they were fairly tightly connected, to say it very simply. And here comes a guy and said, like, no, 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 no. Well, a lot of the stuff that's in the Bible, in, the main book at the time, is wrong. How dare you say that, right? A lot of what the political and the religious and knowledge leader at the time, what you're saying is wrong. God did not create the earth. The earth is not the center of the universe. The earth is not a disk. We will not fall into, uh, hell when you drop off the bottom. In fact, you can't drop off the bottom because it's a sphere. Yeah, and it moves around the sun. So all of this was really a big revolution. It took a long time, 200 years, for that to become an accepted, way of dealing with knowledge. Right? So it was a revolution because it went against the fundamental principle at the time. At that time, the belief was that, God created the earth. God gave us a bunch of laws, like, 10 laws by Moses in the stone. And this is how we should live. And everything we need to know is in the Bible and our interpretation of that Bible. So we went from a position of we know everything, or the leaders at the time, we know everything about how everything works and how it was constructed. And if there's just lightning, then God must be angry at us and so forth, to a completely opposite position, namely, well, first of all, we realize we don't know anything. Yeah. So the base position fundamentally changed from we technically know everything, it's just a matter of interpreting the texts better, let's say the Bible. And now we move to a position is, well, we don't know everything, and what we know is probably wrong. Yeah. No concept, no idea, no theory is sacred beyond challenge. Yeah. And the things that we think we know could be proven wrong as we get better at doing the science stuff and as we gain more knowledge. Because one of the big learnings from the Copernicus and Galileos of the time that showed that the the geocentric model, the Ptolemaic model of where the Earth is the center of the universe, through better measurement, through better data, through more careful observations, was proven wrong. Well, if we were wrong with this, what else are we wrong about? Yeah. So the willingness to admit ignorance and to start from a position of skepticism and accepting the principle that what we know is probably wrong was a huge shift, right? And it holds to this day. So we may laugh about this example from the 1500s where people thought that the earth is flat, but I can guarantee you there's many, many things that people 200 years ago from laugh about what we think we know, right? So knowledge is very temporary, it's very fluid, and it's probably wrong. Yeah. The second part is then if we can't trust the knowledge we have gathered so far, and that is in our books, what is then a more central element? Well, observation becomes a more fundamental cornerstone of knowledge creation than theory or than writings or experience of learnings of the past. If we don't know if we can still trust or if we can even begin to trust the knowledge we already have, where do we get knowledge or better knowledge from? Well, from observation. From observation combined, yeah, Francis Bacon, with formal language like logic, mathematics, etc., so that we can construct explanations and theories that are better than what we used to have. And the third aspect that became now relevant is that when we do that, we are actually generating power. Yeah. So the point of scientific research is not just to come up with explanations, but to use this explanation in developing new powers for the betterment of the human condition. Now I'm putting this in quotation marks because this is of course a stretchable term, right? The betterment of the human condition could be curing cancer, but it could also involve, creating nuclear bombs for better welfare, right? And so the point to say here is that the betterment of the human condition is a pretty vague concept to be interpreted, but we moved to a position where science all of a sudden became a basic, not just for explaining the world around us, but for making it better. Yeah, through knowing more, through understanding more, by coming up with new techniques and tools for, I don't know, um, uh, sowing crops, building roads, transporting water, harnessing the energy of, the wind and the sun and everything around us, right? So all of a sudden, it was not just a tool for explaining what is, but also a tool for how can we make it better. And this is the scientific revolution that became the basis for what we now call the scientific methods that we use to judge how good a particular piece of science is, or in fact, how good particular scientists are, right? So this was the basis. And then, of course, over the next 100 years that followed, people tried to make these scientific methods and these principles, refine them and update them and so forth. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier a book called Karl Popper, Logic of Scientific Discovery. And this was written much later, right, in the 20th century. So not too long ago, if you think about it. And one of the stories around this book is that when Popper thought about this, he was thinking about the most famous scientists of that time, right? Early 20th centuries. We had Sigmund Freud, in Austrian, very, very famous. You're sort of like a superstar, a media star, you would call him today, uh, um, for his psychoanalysis, right? So Sigmund Freud was the inventor, you can say, of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and psychology as we know it today. And of course, you had this weird guy who was sitting in the patent office in Munich and came up with the best, explanations and predictions in physics, right? The law of relativity and so forth. You had Albert Einstein. And Popper sat in his office and was like, well, of these two, well, who's the better scientist? Well, Einstein wasn't even, he wasn't a scientist to begin with. He didn't even finish his university, right? So he was a clerk in the patent office. Freud, on the other hand, was a superstar. Yeah, he was the poster child in academia. He had a PhD and everything, and was a professor and all that sort of stuff. And he was well known, and he was very, very famous. Yeah, and so Popper tried to distill, well, how do we know who's doing the better science here? Yeah, they're both famous, so to speak. They're not doing the same things, and they're not doing these things the same way. right? Cut the story short, he came up with an analysis and concluded that Einstein was the better scientist, right? Because Freud came up with a whole bunch of theories, yeah, Oedipus complex, and all boys basically secretly want to go back to the mother and all this sort of stuff. But Einstein made predictions that were testable, that could be proven or disproven through experiments, and sort of had a precise hypothesis and so forth. So, and this work, this sort of thought experiment of who's the better scientist at the time, led then to what is now known as the key principles of the scientific method, right? So by looking at, okay, who here now two people that are famous scientists, but they work very differently. Can I find a way of distinguishing good science from bad science? Right? So now that we know that science becomes the basis for the acquisition of knowledge and new powers, how should we do it? Should we do it more like Freud or should we do it more like Einstein? Right? And one of Karl Popper's key things in his book is that he laid out some of these principles, and of course they get refined over time. And now I want to tell you a couple of these in basically some of the main principles that we now consider as cornerstones of doing science well. Right? One of them is this notion of replicability. Replicability means that the procedures by which you do research, you should do them and you should document them in a way that allows others to independently repeat the procedures and obtain the same results. Right? That means replicability. So good science should be replicable. It should not be a function of myself, of the situation or the context in which I'm in, or the way that I'm doing this. Like, in other words, if you do the same experiments that I've done and you do it the same way, you should get the same results. It should be replicable, right? So replicability is a cornerstone of the scientific method because it is a test to say, like, look, this is not it's serendipity. It hasn't been luck. It's not some subjective individual thing that I've done in a weird way. It's not my own interpretation. It's objectively, it's repeatable, it's a persistent finding. It's always going to be like that, right? It's always the same. So then it must be true. That's the idea. Yeah. And replicability is a key thing. Yeah. Here's an example from a couple of years ago. About 10 years ago by now. Gee, I'm getting old. Because people at that time did an interesting thing. They went back and tried to reproduce some of the most established and most world famous psychology theories of our time. Again, not 300 years ago, not 500 years ago, when the church dominated the world and we all believed the earth was flat. No, no, no. Like the last, in my lifetime at least, right? So in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, and so forth, right? So what they did is this guy, Brian Nosek here, and a team, he took the 100 most famous studies in psychology, why do we get addicted to drugs? Why do we help people on the street? Why you should call fire and not for help? Sort of why do people do the things they do? Psychology stuff. And he replicated the experiments of these famous psychological theories that are world famous. And he figured out that I think in 1/3 of the studies, he could replicate the results. He got the same result. In another third of the studies, he got kind of similar, but not really. And in the third, he wasn't able to replicate any of the findings in the same way whatsoever. They got completely different results. This was big news, and it was called the reproducibility crisis in psychology. Yeah, again, 10 years ago, because it cast doubt on the knowledge that we had created with our also modern science in a key aspect of the human condition, namely psychology. Like, why do people do the things they do? If we can't trust that, even now, 500 years after the scientific revolution, then how good is our science? Yeah, and it's interesting because as a consequence of this reproducibility crisis in psychology, then other fields, including business and management we are in, started to also do these reproducibility tests. So in other words, it implored us to take this notion of replicability a lot more seriously, right? So, for example, what then happened is that our journals and the outlets for scientists in business and management start paying more attention to replication. Yeah, they created journals, they have special issues, they created outlets saying like, look, we want to encourage scientists to worry more and do more replications and reproducibility of finding not just a new thing. We need to reconfirm and disconfirm whether what we think we know is still holds to this day. Yeah, this is a direct function of reproducibility, which we know is a principle of good science, but we haven't paid attention to it very. So, second principle is this notion of independence. Yeah, independence means that whatever your research is about and whatever you find should be impartial and freed from the research or the research team itself. So independence is this classic notion of the scientist and the white lab coat overlooking a study as an outsider. He's not part of that, or they're not part of this. They're overlooking their subjects objectively, impartial, freed from any bias or subjective judgment. Yeah. So we're trying to get to objective knowledge. And of course, we shouldn't let our own, biases, our own beliefs, our own prejudice, our own superstitions come into this, right? So science should be independent. Well, that's easily said than done. Yeah, because first of all, science is always done by people, and whether you want it or not, you are not objective. I am not objective. None of us is objective. So we're always subjective. We always have our biases, we have our preconceptions, we have superstitions, we have beliefs, we have values, we have, a particular way in which we were brought up, and all these sorts of things are not impartial, and they are subjective, and they're bound to me, right? So whether I want it or not, I myself cannot actually be objective. So when I do science, it can't actually be objective and independent, fully independent. Yeah. And of course, this is one way of looking. Another way is there's also a lot of examples where independence was purposely violated. This is a very famous example of this because this is the invention of LSD. LSD, the drug, yeah, a hallucinogenic drug, was invented in a lab as a sort of like a byproduct of something else. And this guy, Albert Hoffman, when he realized he has this new drug that may or may not be hallucinogenic, he he said, like, well, I'm a scientist, I'm objective, right? I can test myself. Yeah, that's a good way because I don't have to, take human subjects and administer a potentially dangerous drug to them. So he very famously self-administered LSD to himself and tried to be the good, objective, independent scientist and take objective notes of what was happening to him, right? So, for example, there's this protocol that he wrote after he injected, after he took LSD. And he wrote down, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. And when you read on the protocol, it gets more and more, because he was getting more and more high, so to speak, and he, drifted up into a very weird hallucinogenic state where, of course, all his objectivity and independence went out of the window, so to speak. Which is why self-experimentation is not allowed in science. Yeah, because you by definition give up your objectivity by experimenting on yourself. And on the webpage here you can see a whole bunch of examples. But there's also other types of examples where this independence is really violated. A good example for that is tobacco, the tobacco industry, and how it tries to manipulate or influence the science on the health benefits of smoking. Yeah, there's a movie, Thank You for Smoking. You may not even remember this because you're too young for this, right? So when I was basically your age, that came out, and it's a movie about the lobbyism of the tobacco industry. It's not directly related to science, but you can see the same sort of aspect here. There's a couple of papers, of course, also on this, on the manipulation of research. And here I'm just summarizing it, right? So the tobacco industry has a long history of engaging with independent science, right? So, smoking was a bigger deal in the age of my parents or your grandparents, of course. But of course, there was very early on, there was science saying, look, this is actually bad for your health. You get cancer and you can die from smoking. And it has an interesting history of how it dealt with this independent science that basically said, warned everybody about the health dangers of smoking. Yeah. Which of course was a threat to the business model, right? You want to sell cigarettes, then of course you don't want to have it look bad. In the 50s, their position was they refuted data. They just refuted and said, like, no, the scientists got it wrong. It's all bullshit. Yeah, it's all fake. In the 60s, after that became less and less persuasive, less and less good an argument that they could still win because the amount of evidence the scientists created was overwhelming. In the 60s, they shifted the tactics to hiring a whole bunch of lawyers and threatening all the researchers with lawsuits. Yeah, either the researchers themselves, the institutions, or the funding bodies. Now, and if you're a little scientist doing health, experiments with smoking at the University of Hamburg, anywhere else, and then you get, Marlboro or whatever Camel or whatever they're called, um, threatening you with a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit, that is pretty intimidating. So that worked for a while, but after a while, universities started hiring lawyers too, and then legal battles ensued that actually tobacco industry couldn't really win, right? Because the science, basically, the knowledge was getting overwhelming, so to speak, and in court, this threatening tactic didn't no longer work, right? But then beginning it worked very perfectly because usually at that time, university didn't really have a legal department. We have now, because unfortunately, scientists need to be protected against legal threats at some stage. But this is it. So then, a couple of decades later, um, they shifted to a new strategies, which is that they provided funding for research centers. So they generously donated money to fund entire research, like the Center for Indoor Air Research, funded by Philip Morris, the tobacco company, and there's a whole bunch of them. Of course, with the money in these research institutions, the position they created for scientists, where researchers get a salary and so forth, allowed them to kind of have a hand over what was being done and what was being published in these centers, and they continue to this day. So the Center for Indoor Air Research still exists to this day. It's still funded by Philip Morris, and it has a surprising record of of saying all the good things that might stem from smoking. Yeah, so this is an example where independence is being violated in research, and you see several of these. Where it's sort of like a clear-cut example is here, or it could be a little bit more, I guess, in the gray zone or on the borderline. So, for example, what happens quite a lot in business management is that you do research with firms. Like I do a lot of research with firms, Volkswagen, Olympus, Edeka, what have you. And it kind of gets tricky as soon as they sort of put money or other types of resources, investing that into the research. And then typically they get a position that they want the research to make them look good. And of course, you may find in your research not everything they do is brilliant, but it could create all sorts of problems. And then that could be a problem where they want to use this as a sort of PR or marketing thing, and the signs or your findings may contradict this, and that usually gets to some sort of thing that needs to be resolved. Yeah, but we know this by now, and there's ways of protecting against it. So this is independence. The third principle I want to highlight here is precision. Now, precision goes back to this idea of Francis Bacon and saying like, well, we need to constantly update our measurements, our technologies, our instruments for doing science, because then we get better observation, better data, and with better data, we can more carefully scrutinize what we think we know and come up with better theories of what we know, right? So everything in science, all measurements, all observations, all conceptualization should be as carefully and precisely as done as possible, so that we can constantly refine, revise, and challenge what we think we know. Yeah, precision in the past, I told you that earlier, is this, for example, the invention of the telescope that allowed you to challenge what looked like a centric movement of planetary objects around the Earth, what actually was an elliptic movement of planetary objects around the sun, well, which you can't really see with your naked eyes, but you can see with the early version of the telescope, or of course modern telescopes that can look much better into, I don't know, the universe or everywhere else where we want. Yeah. A more modern example of precision is, for example, what's called neuroscience. Yeah. So certain instruments that allow us to, for example, measure activity in our brain while we're doing things. Yeah. So we do this a lot in marketing or in technology research, where we, strap on eye tracking devices or fMRI devices that measure brain activities or measure your pupil dilation and your eye gaze and stuff like this. For example, to see if I build an ad, a commercial, where are people looking? Yeah, this is an example on the right. This is from a so-called eye tracking device, which tracks where people look on a screen or on a poster or anywhere else on the television. And you can see here, for example, that the first and most intense point of fixature that people have is in the baby's face, because people love babies, and baby faces are very something that people get drawn to. Then we have this, it's called the zigzag move, a Z move. And very often in marketing, we look from the top left to the top right, across to the bottom left, and then the bottom right. So the top left and bottom right are good places to place your logos or your key messages. And whatever is in the middle, we don't really see. For example, here, we may see the big caption, but no one reads the text really, right? So this is why we place certain advertising materials in certain positions, because we now know through more precise measurements where people actually look. We don't look everywhere in the same way. Right. And the next principle that is very important is a notion of falsifiability. And this one goes back to Karl Popper. Yeah. Remember, that was the guy that looked at Einstein and Freud and asked who's the better scientist here? Yeah. So they're both doing science, different fields, etc. How do we know which of them is doing it well? One of the key things that he found out is that one of the key distinctions between Freud's theories about psychoanalysis and Einstein's theory about, physics, gravity, and planets and space-time and whatnot, is that in theory, Einstein's predictions, his theories, could be falsified. They could be proven wrong. Yeah. So, and this, Popper concluded, is a hallmark of good science, that we generate new knowledge or new hypotheses, new possible knowledge, that it is logical and possible to disconfirm. Yeah. Yeah. So ensuring a logical possibility that an assertion, hypothesis, a prediction, an explanation can be contradicted by an observation or other outcome of a scientific study or experiment. So in other words, when Einstein said that, like light falls in this particular way, and that mass is related to energy in this and this in particular equation, in theory, it is logically possible to disprove that. Yeah, it is possible to construct an experiment where, if the apple falls up instead of down, then we would have disproven this explanation. Hasn't happened yet. That shows how good that theory is, but it is possible. Yeah. By contrast, that's why religion and religious, let's call them theories, religious beliefs, religious explanations, they're not scientific theories. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying they're not scientific theories because they're not falsified. If you say something like God's love is incomprehensible, then you by definition say that, there is this thing called God's love, and if we see it, great, but if not, it could be that it's not there, or that we don't comprehend it because it is incomprehensible to human. So by saying that something exists that I cannot prove or disprove, you make it non-falsifiable. So any decision, I can always go back and say, well, this is faith or whatever else. So again, not debunking a religion here. I'm just saying this is why, from a scientific point of view, we don't regard religious theories as a scientific theory because they're not falsifiable. Yeah, if God's love is incomprehensible, there's no way of disconfirming or ever refuting that claim. Yeah. And of course, there's a whole bunch of theories that people came up with that have been falsified later, right? That have been shown to be wrong later, yeah, through falsification, through the process of subjecting an explanation to a test and conclusively proving that that theory must be wrong. Yeah, one example is equivocal generation. This is the idea of the alchemist that turns stone into gold. Yeah, so, or that life can originate from inanimate matter. Yeah, so again, in the Middle Ages, we saw, for example, you see rocks by the sea, and they just lay there and they look bare and rotten. And after a while, they start green, and algae are growing on it. They start to smell, and clearly there's organic life going on. But it's a rock. How can that happen, right? So this then led to these theories of equivocal generation, that you can create life out of inanimate matter. Now, that we later knew is that was never the case. What happened is that there were bacteria, invisible bacteria, living on these rocks by the sea, and then through the sunlight and the ocean and the wind and whatever else, they sort of like they spread further and populated and eventually started growing observable things like algae, right? So Pasteur and his research on bacteria, yeah, and germs, etc., showed that there was never life from inanimate matter. There was just life coming, observable life coming from much, much smaller, much less visible life, right? That you couldn't see with your naked eye, but you could see under the microscope. Another theory that has been disproven is this theory of phrenology, which was the idea that the shape of your skull is indicative of your cognitive abilities. Okay, so if your upper left part of your skull is formed a particular way, it means that you're, more of an introvert, an extrovert, or whatever else, better with numbers, etc., and so forth. Right? And you may have seen measurement devices that are still in some psychology clinics, for example. You might be like, if you go to psychotherapists, that sometimes for historical reasons they still have these things that allow you to measure the shape of your skull, but of course it's nonsense. Yeah. So falsification, replicability, independent precision, four key principles of scientific work, of doing science well, of using observations and data and measurements to question what we know and come up with better explanations of what goes on. Now, I will end here because I want to go back to something we actually talked about last week very briefly, which is this lady here. If all of these principles were true and indicative of the real and the right way of doing science, what about Jane Goodall and her work with her research on the apes, right? So Jane Goodall is a very famous, we call it an anthropologist, so someone that studies the nature of the human condition, right? So she was interested in social systems, like why do we have these things called families? Are we the only ones that have families? And she did research with apes, yeah, with gorillas, and with chimpanzees, with primate apes, because we know they're genetically very close to humans. And she did this research not in a lab, not with an experiment, but by living with the apes, in the settings in which they work, which is in the jungle. So if you think about it, this is not independent. She's not independent. She's not objective. It wasn't even very precise. No experimentation, no quantification. She was observing and sort of communicating with the apes. That's not very precise, so to speak. And she still came up with theories and explanations for, how social structures in primates, in apes, in humans, how we form, etc., and what the role plays and so forth, how the social structure works. So if you think about it, many of these important pieces of knowledge that she created were outright violating the scientific principles that I just explained to you. And this is indicative of some of the distinctions that then happened, which showed the limit of this traditional scientific method, and that then led to the birth, for example, amongst others, of qualitative methods. And that is something that we will discuss in the next lecture. If you want to read more on the parts that I just explained to you, this brief recap of the history and philosophy of science, these are books that I draw upon. They're very good. Chalmers is a great book. It's very small too. Yuval Harari's book is also brilliant. So read up on these, and we will continue in the next video lecture, with the rise of new philosophical assumptions in the beginning of qualitative research. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching.